Well, these are some thoughts about the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. I want to apologize in advance that some of you will have heard an earlier version of this, I think, because, there's a complicated story about how this paper made its way through Catholic University and then re-emerged here. And it wasn't until I was a week away from coming here that I remembered that I'd given it sometime in 2000 and something in a very, very different version. But this is what happens when you get old. You remember what you forget, or only too late after having forgotten it. Aristotle's ethical treatises, that means the Nicomachean and the Eudemian ethics mainly, invite us to think about what it is to lead a good life. And for a good life, we're meant to read here a happy life, a life such as any one of us should want to choose for ourselves. That's a life that is characterized by virtues enacted deliberately, but with the grace of habit. It is a life of genuine pleasure and satisfaction, a life of deserved dignity and honor well merited. It's a life that we might look upon and look back upon with pride and with a sense of having achieved whatever fulfillment circumstance allows. That is absolutely and clearly more than any of us can reasonably hope for, given the vicissitudes that as ordinary middle people we face. But it represents, nonetheless, what there is to be asked for. It represents the intentional object of our desire to be happy. I should be clear that when I speak of a good life or a happy life, I mean to be speaking of a good or a happy human life. That's not because Aristotle might think of animals other than humans as incapable of happiness. He may or may not. He says he does, but it's not altogether clear. Animals other than human, even if incapable of world-making, inhabit worlds of one sort or another. This is especially true of those of us, whom we seduce into, or by whom we have been seduced to grant entry into, the human world. Their well-being, if for none other than selfish reasons, and surely for noble ones as well, is therefore of interest to us. But the reason that our concern as moral philosophers is with the contours of a good human life is because we who are inquiring are ourselves human and are inquiring with respect to our own performance. Our concern is with what we are to do. And since doing and its enabling agency and consequent character are the fabric of our lives, it should go without saying that our inquiry into how we can achieve a good and happy life must mean how we can achieve a good and happy human life. Aristotle thinks that this is clearly true, although, and we might find it interesting to reflect on this fact, he doesn't think that it goes without saying. And so early in the Ethics, he reminds his readers that the goodness that we are concerned with is clearly human, for the good we are in search of is human, and the happiness human. When, therefore, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle repeats, as though by way of summary, that the essence of such a happy life, he calls it eudaimonia, consists of activities in accord with virtue, kat eratein energeas. We are to read in accord with human virtues. If the discussion ended there, we would do well to say that a good human life, for Aristotle, is one whose activities conform with the requirements and abilities of human virtue, and that the best life realizes the best of these virtues. Its well-being is an active human well-being. But the discussion doesn't end there, and in what might be a coda, but looks more like a second thought, we learn that the best of our virtues is not so much a virtue of our human nature, but of our divinity, or of that in us which is theotaton, most divine, and that its activity involves having in mind the beauty and the divinity of the world. This is the first item, I think, on the handout. But if happiness consists, Aristotle writes, in activity in accordance with virtue, it's reasonable that it should be activity in accordance with the highest virtue, and this will be the virtue of the best part of best part of us. Whether then this is the intellect or whatever else that is thought to rule and lead us by nature, and to have cognizance of what is noble and divine, either as being itself also actually divine, or as being relatively the divinest part of us, it is the activity of this part of us, in accordance with the virtue proper to it, that will constitute perfect happiness. And it has been stated already that this activity is the speculative or contemplative, the theoretike. This activity of perfect happiness is said to be theoretike, which I've here rendered either by contemplative or speculative, though had my English been more Greek than Latin, I might have used the term theoretical. But speculative here doesn't mean hypothetical, nor does contemplative mean nor does theoretical mean notional and abstract, nor yet, as we'll see, does contemplative mean thoughtful, pensive, or brooding. The word of which these words are translations is a word that signifies looking at or seeing something, as spectators do when looking at, perhaps with the help of their spectacles, a spectacle worth seeing, or like what goes on in a theater, or like a theory in this antique sense of a body of envoys conveyed to see an oracle. Its operative noun is theoria, the seeing or witnessing of something, again, like a spectacle or theatrical performance. This is something of a surprise. We thought of happiness as a kind of human activity, and it turns out to be something more like a divine seeing. What's happened to bring this about? What leads Aristotle to describe perfect happiness not only as human, but as something that is divine, and not simply as acting, but in addition, as seeing? Well, let's begin with the claim that the seeing has to do with divinity. We might have expected that the divine would not appear at all in Aristotle's ethical treatises, because the concern of human agency, on his view, is with the human good, as I started saying. It's human welfare and human happiness that are the ends of our desire and choice. Practical agency is concerned neither with the satisfaction of some higher good, nor with obedience to the will of some superior being, and happiness is subordinate to no alternative good for whose realization we are obliged to strive. And it's human deliberation, with no recourse to divinely delivered code, whose office it is to guide our action. It's therefore appropriate that we think of Aristotle's eudaimonism as naturalistic, and to discover the sudden invocation of the divine seems odd and to some embarrassing, like discovering that a favorite uncle, the logician who regularly smokes weed, also regularly takes communion or lays tefillin every morning. This makes it understandable that many readers either quietly ignore these parts of the text or imagine that the discussion is not that of the mature Aristotle, who probably did smoke weed, but not surely in his mature years. It's true that for Aristotle, the divine does not ground the possibility of a happy life in any legislative manner. There's no intimation in these pages of a deity who might serve either as source or as underwriter of moral injunction. And that's not surprising. In a theory based on virtue, what's central is not the response to external command, but character, the infused skill of virtuous deliberation. And when, as at the very end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle considers the laws that need to be in place to encourage and serve in the formation of such character. It is to legislation as a branch of human political science that he appeals. Of course, even a robustly theistic ethics might picture the divine as a principle of agency rather than a source of directives. In a famous Talmudic episode, a rabbi appeals for divine endorsement in a dispute that he is losing, and then appears to receive just such endorsement in the form of a voice from heaven, no less, which calls out and announces to all that his is the correct view. But the rabbi is instantly reminded by a colleague with whom he is arguing that heavenly voices are not authoritative in matters of practical deliberation. And God, in one of those moments of illicit anthropomorphism that the Talmud loves, is pictured as pleased with this outcome, laughingly happy that his children have, as he puts it, defeated him. Here the divine has become, more than lawgiver, a principle of legal deliberation, the Aryeh of boulesis. And so, for Aristotle, indeed, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, the text is explicit. This is the second thing on the handout. The divine, we there read, is not a ruler issuing commands, but that in light of which practical wisdom commands. Aristotle immediately explains is used in to act huheneka, that in light of which is, Aristotle immediately explains, is used in two senses, leaving unsaid the clear implication that he here means only one. The distinction is elaborated in several places, perhaps most succinctly in Metaphysics 12:7, in the course of explaining that final cause relative to unmoving things. He there says that the huheneka, for the sake of something and for something's sake, is different. That is, for the good in light of something and for good of something. And the one he means here, that is, in light of, is clearly the former, for there is no good that the divine is in need of, for the sake of which one is required to act. We, therefore, rather than the divine, are that for whose sake, that is, for whose good, prudence guides our actions. This is made clear as Aristotle continues his discussion at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. This is number 3 on your handout. So whatever choice in the acquisition of natural goods, whether of the body or of wealth or of friendship or of any of other goods, most brings about seeing the divine, will be the best. And this is the very finest standard. Whereas whatever through lack of superfluity or superfluity hinders our searching, our serving and seeing the divine, that's bad. The interesting phrase that I think should invite our attention here, besides the usual phrase of too much and too little, is the phrase hetu theo theoria, which I've rendered as seeing the divine, but which is more commonly translated as the contemplation of God. I stress this for the same reason for which I've quoted the passage from the Nicomachean Ethics in the first place. Aristotle's discussion in Nicomachean Ethics 10:7 easily leads us to suppose that he is here talking simply about the delight of a life of theoria, understood by some to be something like philosophical reflection on developed theories of the universe. I find it odd to think that the eudaimonia Aristotle has been promising to elucidate for us should turn out to be the sole possession of a small band of philosophers and scientists, even though it's like us, well enough advanced in years, well, you guys don't count in that, to understand fully the principles that govern the universe's operation. And so I'd note, do many commentators who nevertheless are of the opinion that that's what Aristotle has in mind, and find it puzzling that he does. The thought that what he has in mind is the contemplation of God may seem no less odd, but it may at least complicate our picture. That's why I've invoked the text from the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, and that's why I've suggested that in the Nicomachean Ethics as well, there's an echo of seeing the divine. The first thing I need to do is make my rendering of he tu theoria more plausible, and then I'll want to ask what its implications are for understanding Aristotle's sees, as in God, as in we, as in the happy man, sees the divine. I think that part of the reward of translating theoria as contemplation is to soften the audacity of talk about viewing or seeing God. The thought that the highest happiness, according to Aristotle, should be a mystical vision of the sort thought to be reserved for prophets and their like should seem to us, I think, as odd as the thought of the happy band of philosophers I earlier questioned. And even the prophet Moses received but a fleeting glimpse of God's back. But God said, "You cannot see my face, for no human sees me and lives." And those of you who will remember this phrase, the history of this phrase in the Bible, it comes up over and over again, sometimes with God saying, okay, you can see a little of me, and other times not. Well, it's an odd phrase, and part of what I want to do here is invite us to reread the meaning of my phrase, the thought that what Aristotle has in mind in the contemplation of God. The thought that the highest happiness might be a mystical vision of the sort reserved for prophets. I would like us to rethink that and rethink what a mystical vision really means. So how are we to understand what Aristotle means when he speaks of contemplating the divine? When Aristotle, in Book 12 of the Metaphysics, appeals to the divine as the principle of being, it's tempting to understand ourselves as having come to a moment in our thinking in which, having discovered something to be divine, we then come to see it, for that reason, as the principle of being, of ousia. We're now talking about Book 12 of the Metaphysics, in that long passage when Aristotle reveals the principle of being to be, in some sense, the divine. But that's not how principles reveal themselves to us. We now know better than to suppose that, according to Aristotle, first principles of scientific explanation sorry, I missed a page here. Forgot to turn it over. First principles of scientific explanation are simply grasped by I'm going to take a chair. I'm happier sitting down. That's not how principles reveal themselves to us. We now know better than to suppose that, according to Aristotle, first principles of scientific explanation are simply grasped by a faculty of insight and then shined with the noetic power of archaic illumination upon a murky, confused world of particulars, which then arrange themselves in rank and file for the first time to be seen and understood in a well-ordered body of scientific discourse. That's how I was taught, and I think we now know better. That is, I was taught that the grasping by Aristotle of first principles was a noetic grasp which learned the principles, and then, learning the principles, was able to reflect upon the particulars in light of these principles, which were already known. But I think we know better than that now. We know better than to attribute such a view to Aristotle, of course, because Aristotle knew better than to think that scientific principles are thus grasped. What he knew is that the body of scientific discourse comes first to be known. Slowly, we come to understand first principles by the power they reveal with respect to that body of discourse. That is, our coming to understand first principles occurs by the power of those principles to explain the particulars, and it's in seeing them explain the particulars that we come to understand the principles. Slowly we come to understand first principles by the power they reveal with respect to the body of discourse, the illuminating powers of explanation by which we at once know the world and the principles by which it is made intelligible. He learned this, by the way, from Plato, but developed it to a fine point in the Posterior Analytics, which I urge you to go back and read with that in mind. And so it must be that which is first principle of all, he who spoke and the world was. So our thinking should not be of understanding the divine, which is then revealed to be the principle of being. We should instead think of understanding that which is the principle of being as, just because it is the principle of being, divine. Similarly, imagining a cardinal feature of God as awareness, we might understand this as our coming to see the principle of the awareness we have of the world, of the thinking percipient consciousness we refer to as nous or Geist or mind, as for that very reason, divine. That's Aristotle's strategy. He asks us to see the ways in which something explains the being of the world, and then, because the being of the world is divine, that thing, by virtue of its explanatory power of the world, comes to acquire the divinity of a principle. That's Aristotle's strategy, and failing to notice it, for example, leads translators to mistakenly render the opening words of Metaphysics 12:9 when Aristotle is talking about the fact that thought is divine as referring to the thought of God, rather than to thought which has been described as divine and which now needs to be understood as divine, that is, the finest of things. Well, the divinest of things. I'll question that later on. Divine thought, in other words, need not be understood like divine providence. Read it rather like Milton's divine melancholy, or, as I read recently in the food section of my newspaper, as I'm sure you might have in yours, a divine Pinot Noir. I read that in Dryden's Divine Cecilia was the other example I had in mind. That Pinot Noir, the divine Pinot Noir I read about in my food section of the New York Times, need not have been the wine that was drunk at Cana, any more than the amphorae that contain a theon poton set aside for Odysseus' return, this is in Odyssey 2:341, must have held ambrosia, which is the potion of the gods. Notice that nothing on this proposal intends to deny or even to deflate the presence of the divine in Aristotle's argument, but rather merely to understand it. It's part of what I've elsewhere called a project of philosophical hermeneutics, a project akin to the biblical hermeneutics that sets out to understand what it means to say that God led Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So here I want to entertain this thought. When Aristotle talks about seeing the divine, hetu theou theoria, we are to think of looking at the world and seeing it, as it were, under the descriptor of divinity, of seeing the world qua divine, which means, among other things, seeing the world as worthy of worship and awe and honor. There's another feature of seeing the world as divine to which I want to draw attention. Seeing something under a description is not a project to be accomplished by redirecting one's gaze. Here's the thought. When we are standing together at forest's edge, looking at the trees before us, we need to turn around to see the field that lies behind us. And we may need to look hard to the left to see the beginning of the trail we came up on. But to discern my cabin in the woods just ahead, we may need only to look more carefully and in a certain way, or we may need to be trained to make it out, to have the eye of an accomplished woodsman, as scientists have accomplished eyes and are trained to know what it is that they're seeing, which we can't see, but which they can see, let alone to understand it. Such a theoretic gaze, this act of speculation, doesn't involve looking at something else or looking in another direction. And it isn't a regard that can be achieved through a simple act of the will. It involves the refiguring rather than the redirecting of one's scrutiny. It involves knowing how to see, seeing intelligently with wisdom and understanding. And here the interpretation of theoria that I've been encouraging obviously is applicable to the remarks from the Nicomachean Ethics, which is obviously applicable to the remarks from the Nicomachean Ethics, begins to echo Aristotle's description in the Nicomachean Ethics as well, and in the works of Wittgenstein as well, too, which Aristotle wrote, obviously. That description begins by noting that happiness is activity in accord with our highest virtue, most likely the intellect, but whatever it is that is able to form a conception of the noble and the divine, perikalon kai theon. I said that there are things which might require for their proper discerning a training of the eye, and I hope this might resonate with Aristotle's remarks in the Nicomachean Ethics, for it's a similar training, a training that enables us to make the right choices in life, the hairesis kai ktesis, ton fuse agathon, the choices and acquisitions of natural goods. It's a similar training that makes available to us, to one degree or another, hetu theou theoria, the seeing of the divine. We can think of it this way. The proper development of virtue enables a vision capable of seeing in the world, the very world that one's actions might have been instrumental in determining, capable of seeing in that world the noble and divine. The two necessary features of a happy life, subjective and objective, are realized in such vision. Divine virtue enables us an experience of one's world as divine, and such experience is necessary, for it's not enough for a happy life that a person live virtuously and that her life be a good life. Awareness of that life as good is required for the life to be described as happy. It's just such awareness that the vision provides. The vision is of what is noble and divine. I hope it's clear that I'm not suggesting that one, by virtue of this vision alone, becomes a good person. I mean, one has to still engage in the development of virtues that make up the complex being that is the being of a good person. This is really only about what's involved in our coming to be able to see the world under the aspect of divinity, sub specie eternitatis, as a later philosopher was to put it. But we haven't really answered our initial question, for what we initially set out to know is why Aristotle describes some features of a successful human life as involving something divine. One might think it's sufficient to mark these features as revealing this or that excellence of a human life, affording such a life happiness, in this or that respect, and therefore constituting part of what it means to live a successful and fulfilled human life. But what should then thoroughly startle us is the subsequent thought of Aristotle, which is the next thing I think on your handout, but such a life would be beyond that of a human being. For it's not insofar as he is human that someone will live such a life, but insofar as there is something divine about him. What I've had to say is meant to point to Aristotle's thought of our awareness of the world as involving an awareness of what is divine, the thought of a connection between a person being virtuous and that person's ability to experience, that is, to witness the divinity of the world. But why should such divinity be a part of the picture at all? Why isn't it appropriate to understand Aristotle as invoking simply the good of the world? And then we will want to explain the supplemental presence of the divine, rather than merely of such good, both as witnessed and as present in the one who witnesses. Well, perhaps it's not supplemental. Perhaps divinity is invoked to mark something on a scale of goodness, importance, beauty, or power. Isn't the divine, I've hinted at this earlier, the principle of the good, just as it is the principle of being and of activity? Recall how the activity of thinking comes to be called divine in Metaphysics 12:9. Aristotle invokes the notion of divine thought, but makes clear that he means not the thinking of a god, but thinking as divine, that is to say, as the best. The idea of thinking as divine recalls the saying of Euripides, "The mind is a god," on your handout. He nous gar hemon estin en hexto theos. But my thought is that we can read here simply, "The mind is divine." And that's indeed how Cicero read Euripides in the Tusculan Disputations. He offers this description of the soul: "Therefore the soul, as I say, is divine," or as Euripides dared to say, is a god. "Ergo animus ut ego dico divinus est ut Euripides audet dicere," as he had the balls to say, is God. And so similarly, God is good, can have the force of virtue, like mind is divine. In Nicomachean Ethics 1:6, Aristotle explains the complex structure of the meaning of good, like being, homonymous but not simply so, in just this way. Predication that identifies something as divine predicates the good of that thing in the category that states what it is. Being, he says, is said in as many senses as being. Good is said in as many senses as being, for it's said in the category of what is good and what is God and nous, etc. In all these cases, we can chart the possibility of a move from X is a God to X is divine, and from that to X is the best. Teresa Stitch Randall is divine doesn't signify her apotheosis, but merely the remarkable brilliance of her voice. She's not, like Tennyson's Helen, divinely tall and most divinely fair, because she is, as Tennyson says, actually a daughter of the gods. Similarly, in Paul Grove's naughty little couplet in his poem At the Literary Party, he's tousled, teddy bearish, and dependable. She's human, she's divine, and she's upendable. There's nothing at contradiction at work. There's something rather merely naughty in the idea. Aristotle notes this use only glancingly in the Nicomachean Ethics. I won't go into that because I realize I'm running late. But it isn't clear that this will work. Divinity is able to serve as a metaphor for what is merely good, as Rothschild for every merely wealthy man, or as the word awesome for all that is more than mediocre. But here we're talking about what is divine in the full and proper sense of the word. And what is to be divine is not the same as what it is to be good. At the beginning of Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle describes divinity as something which is, if a virtue at all, a kind of virtue off the chart, a mode of heroic or divine goodness, as he puts it, that's significantly huper hemas arete, beyond us, a super virtue. As Aristotle recalls Homer as having Priam describe Hector as divine, and then as adding that he doesn't seem to be the son of a human at all, but a god. The thought that divine virtue can belong only to a superman, the son of someone like Jor-El, to whom Jerry Siegel significantly gave a divine name, rather than of Ma and Pa Kent of Smallville, Kansas, is a first cousin to Aristotle's concern. You guys are all too young to remember the birth story of Superman. You remember it, good. A first cousin to Aristotle's concerns in Book 10, which I've already cited, that the happiness which consists of hetu theo theoria, the seeing of the divine, would not be a human life lived he theoreticos qua human being. This is made, qua anthropos rather, qua human being. This is made clear by the fact that in the opening of Book 7, Aristotle thinks of the mode of divine virtue as the opposite, not of something very bad like about us, but of a savage bestiality. The poles of opposition in play here are more than human and less than human. Aristotle's discussion in the opening chapter of Book 7 of the Ethics is illuminating in its revelation of a kind of architectonic in Aristotle's thinking about the modes of failure and of success in the living of a human life. But it will be deceptive if it leads us to think that there is a scale of human success in this achievement of happiness that ranges from bestial to vicious to incontinent to virtuous, and finally to divine. For success in achieving happiness, only virtue and vice count. Continence, meanwhile, enkrateia, is not a stage below virtue, but a way to exhibit virtue, contrasting with sophrosune on the one hand and akrasia on the other, as incontinence is a way of going wrong, contrasting with enkrateia and akalasia. But the greatest infelicity of such a scheme is the placement of the extremes, bestial and divine. For Aristotle, these extremes are not in the spectrum of happiness at all, but outside it, though in different ways. Bestiality is not a bad way of being human. To be bestial is to be subhuman. Divinity, correspondingly, is not a supreme example of human goodness or well-being. A man might be Makarios, as the gods are Makarios, just as a man might be bestial, but that isn't a mode of success of humanity. That's subhumanity and superhumanity. The shine of super virtue appears to be off the scale of happiness altogether. The only appropriate response in relation to such a leap is gratitude, a gratitude appropriately directed to the divine. So where are we? Well, to contemplate God, I have suggested, is to behold the divinity of the world. And this in turn means to see the world, or some aspect of the world, as divine. I went on to suggest that this might in some sense be to see the world as very good. But now it appears that this last suggestion can't be right. The world's divinity is not its goodness, and to see the world as divine is not the same as to see the world as good, much less to make a judgment that the world is good or is to be seen as good. To judge the world, or some part of it as good, is to have the thought that things are succeeding in fulfilling the tasks which their nature affords them, and to make a judgment that this is the case. It is for Aristotle, as it was for Plato, to judge that some entity that is an X is performing well what it is for an X to be an X. The good of each animal involves activities appropriate to the kind of animal it is, and so also, by extension, with artifacts and natural entities other than animals. And the good, as the Nicomachean Ethics announces in its opening lines, is hupant effiete, that at which all things aim. Aim underlies the fact that with which Aristotle begins, the fact that we are here talking about arts, methods, choices, and transactions, the world, that is, of practical endeavor. The good is therefore the natural subject matter of a great part of Aristotle's discussion of the ethics. When a person engages her practical wisdom to make some choice before her, she's considering the right thing to do, what means will achieve ends that are good, or at least better. What means will best bring about the good of those involved, and what will contribute to her good. It is always the means of achieving the good that she has before her in making a decision, in choosing how to act. The fact that in fastidious classificatory beginning courses in ethical theory, Aristotle is not classified as a consequentialist is not because he thinks there's something else than the resultant good by which to judge actions. It's because he's not primarily interested in judging actions, but rather in considering the virtues formed and deformed by the performance of these actions. In any case, it's the good to which choice looks in determining what are the right means for accomplishing the right ends, and thus determining what is to be done. It's phronesis and the associated practical virtues, the virtues that lead up to and facilitate the proper and correct engagement of practical wisdom in, as we saw at the beginning of my remarks, guiding our actions that lead to moral action and therefore lead to accomplishment of the good. And this happens, as we know, not by accident, but because of the right dispositions, because the right virtues of character have been developed in a person. Moral dispositions for choosing how best to act and how best to be affected. So the good is, as I suggested earlier, the natural subject matter of a great part of Aristotle's discussion in the Ethics, but not of all. Let's set aside the small but not insignificant role that a discussion of things like friendship and pleasure, as well as pleasures, play in the account we would like to give of a prosperous human life. At the beginning of chapter 6 of book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle summarizes these several aspects of a prosperous human life, and then in chapter 7 moves away from the judgment and the deliberation and practical consideration of the earlier books and turns to the mode of human consciousness that first drew our attention, theoria. I use the phrase aspects of a prosperous human life because I don't think that Aristotle is discussing different human lives, except insofar as a different life values more or less the aspects of being human that he delineates. And I think that Aristotle thinks of the best human life as one that incorporates all that is of value to a human being. I propose that we look to the Eudemian ethics and think of this theoria in the Nicomachean Ethics associated, I should make that clear, I'm sorry, let me start again. I've proposed that we look at to the Eudemian Ethics and think of the theoria, which in the Eudemian Ethics is associated on the side of the subject with nous, as here something that should be not, of course, in general, but here, at the final moment of Aristotle's account of a successful human life, here associated on the side of the object with the divine. And that we think here, as in the Eudemian Ethics, of theoria as hetu theoria, seeing the world as divine. To see the divinity of the world is to look beyond the structuring of the world that we saw a moment ago as good and bad, as better and worse, and to see something else about the world. It is something else that is the world's divinity, and the awareness of it is what Aristotle here calls theoria, and more expansively calls hetu theou theoria. The association of this seeing, as we read on, with nous should provide us with the clue we need to understand the nature of this seeing the divinity of the world. For nous sees things simply as they are. This is no mean feat to accomplish, to see things simply as they are, but merely to attempt it brings reward. So seeing the world's divinity is to recognize the gracious presentation of the world itself as just what it is and nothing else, and to recognize this presentation as sublime, that is, as eminently itself. To see the world this way is not to have failed in judgment. It is to have relinquished judgment as to good and bad, and as to the success of things, going well or not well. It is simply to accept the presence of the world as the mere, that is, the intense being of the world, a being that in its shining bestows the presence upon sentient beings like ourselves of itself. It is the reply to this presence, the world's presence of itself to us, that is theoria, a reply not to the world as to be dealt with by practical reason, but simply to be witnessed. A reply not of technology, but of worship in response to that which is sublime and gracious and demands not being dealt with, but being merely appreciated. Contemplation of the divine recalls for us the fact that our lives are lives of awareness, lives in which we are able to be conscious of the world, and by being enabled to stand outside of it, of our happiness. The fact that happiness without awareness of it is no happiness at all can be seen in several arguments of Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And now we can see it made clear in Book 10. The concern of this book with human lives based in the exercise of divine theoria is not a concern with the superiority of a contemplative to a political life, that is, contemplative understood as thoughtful, to a political life, or with whether it's better to be a PhD than to be a CEO. It's rather a concern with the fundamental desirability of human awareness, formerly thematized as divine thought. Here, as throughout Aristotle, theoria signifies the active exercise of conscious mind. In the religious mythology that informs Metaphysics 12 and De Anima Book 3, as here in Nicomachean Ethics Book 10, that exercise is figured as the occupation of a god. But Aristotle makes clear elsewhere that human life, in the fullest sense, to zein to kat energian kai hos telos, consists in the active exercise of awareness and knowledge. That's in the Eudemian Ethics 7:12. It's the last thing on your handout. This activity may, as Lambda imagines of God, occur purely with reference to no particular object, but in our lives, awareness is woven into the fabric of our practical activities. And the happiness of a human life is inextricably bound up with that awareness. Note then two characteristics of our lives that are human expressions of divine nous, which we've now recognized in distinguishing the technology of our practical and the viewing of our noetic lives. One, our capacity to lead and not simply to live lives, to act, that is, in the space of normativity, and 2, our capacity to live in the awareness of our lives, to live lives which, if they are happy lives, can be conscious of being happy. What time is it?
5 to 6.
Oh, so I've got just a minute more. Here's a final thought about the divine. I asked whether it, do I have 5 minutes more? Yes. Here's a final thought about the divine. It may or not be Aristotle's. I don't know whether it is. But I would like to think that it might occasion his approval if I were to give it to him, as imagining I someday might. It concerns not so much the question of the divine as of our attention to the divine, and may be thought to be connected with the theoria of the first passage I quoted from the Nicomachean Ethics at 1049b 16, the taking care of things, what's brought up by Socrates in the Euthyphro as the taking care of the gods, as a possibility dismissed of what holiness is, but with its valence reversed. What might our religious lives have to do with our well-being? Perhaps the good of piety can be compared to the good of friendship. We sometimes think that to justify our sense of friendship as a human good, we need to show that having friends is a condition of a happy life. But that may be, in a famous phrase, one thought too many. Aristotle takes having friends simply to be a good for human beings, not interestingly for the gods, just as they are immune from death, so they are from loneliness, and above the requirements of sodality and friendship and love, but for us human beings. But the reason that we want friends, and the reason that we want love, Aristotle argues, is simply because friends are good for humans to have. They enrich our lives in ways that he goes on to elucidate. A life with friends is a better life than one without, for most people. It's not that friends are necessary to happiness. It's simply that even those who are happy still want friends. So it is, this is a question that he raises at the beginning of Book 9 and settles in this way. So it is, I would suggest, with our lives in relation to the divine. It's not that our lives cannot be lived virtuously without attention to the divine. There are perfectly decent human lives that make no reference to it. Some of everyone's best friends are atheists. But to some of us, a life that includes the gratitude, worship, and sanctification that comes through recognizing and invoking the grace and holiness of the divine is a richer and happier life, just as a life of erotic or culinary or aesthetic prosperity is a better life. So there is an act of reaching out to the divinity of the world, which I think is accomplished by seeing just how things are, no more or less. It's accomplished, therefore, by our noetic capacity to grasp the world by a kind of letting go of the world, and that noetic capacity, Aristotle thinks, is divine in us, if we let it be. Of course, this may be reading into the text, but then one of the reasons that I've always loved Aristotle above all is that in addition to all that one can see in the text, there's so much of depth and wisdom to be read into the text. And if this time I've overread into it, I apologize. But thank you for hearing me out.